Welcome everyone to our roundtable event. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respect to elders past and present. A big welcome to our very first Immersion Plus Club exclusive event. Today we are incredibly lucky. We have three experts on our roundtable with quite diverse backgrounds to share their insights on the topic of privacy and ethics. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Mike Madark AO, our very own non-executive chair of NEC Australia. Our second panellist is Dr. Simon Longstaff AO. Dr. Longstaff is the Executive Director at the Ethics Centre. The third guest on our panel is Mark Crossweller, AFSM. Mark is the Director at Ethical Intelligence and has previously been appointed as the head of the National Resilience Task Force. Before we begin, please note that you can interact throughout this webinar using the Q&A box that will hopefully be either on the right or the left side of your screen. At the end of this webinar, we'll leave about 10 minutes to answer as many questions as we can. And the questions that we aren't able to answer, at least within this session, we will actually ask our guests to answer them post-event, and we will send out a nice PDF with all the answers to any more questions that you may have. As everyone is probably aware, today's topic for the roundtable is privacy and ethics. Just last week, one of our panelists, Dr. Simon Longstaff, wrote a piece for the Australian Financial Review where he noted that if Australian businesses were only 10% more ethical than they are now, that would generate a $45 billion uplift in gross domestic product every year. In a time of economic downturn due to COVID, these figures are quite substantial. I'm very, very proud to be part of NEC's renewed focus and investment and development of ethics and values in technology innovation and development. For 150 years, it's been our mission and purpose to create technology that benefits society, spurring on communities and individuals to reach their potential and overcome social challenges, thanks to technological innovation and digital inclusion. Everyone on this call will know that technology has huge potential and the potential it holds in bettering the lives of many. However, it isn't without consequences, especially when we start to change the fabric of how our society functions. Once we start to consider different groups within our own local communities, but also wider society, for example, regional Australia, and how their experiences and access to technology may be different to our own, and what that ultimately means for their development, we start to see ethics in action, evaluating the choices we make every day so that our values are reflected in every stage of our decision-making process, so that the very best of technology is delivered to society to make it better and make the lives of people better. That is essentially ethics in action, as I like to say. So on that note, I'd like to go to our first topic for today and get our panelists talking. So our first topic is digital identity and facial recognition. Just over a month ago, the federal government announced a funding package to improve access to digital services, worth a combined total of $800 million. $257 million will be specifically dedicated to the Digital Identity Program, where technologies such as facial recognition will be used by individuals and businesses to securely access government services online, including MyGov and welfare payments. So our first question is, because of the zero-sum game insecurity, where facial recognition is often used and primarily used in national security purposes, for example, at airports for identity verification due to high national security concerns and risks, the question of privacy in this instance loses out to the technology. The technology is legitimized in this context and capacity by the state. However, will the legitimizing of facial recognition in everyday government services develop any more trust or acceptance of the technology itself by the public in the civic sphere? Simon, can I start with you perhaps to get your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, I suppose where I would start with is your thesis about legitimisation coming from the state presumes that the state itself has legitimacy. And I think that question is being opened up, I think, almost every single day at the moment when you look at the conduct of ministers in state and federal parliaments. And it's not about politics, it's across all parties. And the growing suspicion in the mind of the public that the people who are in charge are partial in serving their own interests rather than the public interest. Now, you mentioned a report that we published at the beginning of this week. All of the analysis was done by Deloitte Access Economics, one of the most reputable economic analysts in the country. And what they found is that a 10% increase, as you said, not just in business, but in the ethics in Australia, so that includes government, would derive these incredible benefits, not just economic, but also improve mental health, physical health, employability. The list goes on. It's quite remarkable. But that happens because a solid improvement in ethics is the thing that underpins trust. And trust, which is so important, both in terms of opportunity, which I'll come back to, but also generally providing a seamless process for societies to progress. It's incredibly fragile. I mean, it's the way I think of it, it's almost like glass, you know, and one adverse touch is enough to break it and the whole thing shatters. And when that happens, you lose not just the immediate costs, but you lose the potential advantages, which brings me back to your question. Facial recognition could be something used for considerable good. And we've seen throughout many periods of time, and most recently with COVID-19, that Australians are quite open to, you know, suppressing some of the liberties that they might otherwise claim if they believe that to do so is going to be for the benefit of society, that it's going to improve our safety and security and things like that. And you cited a few use cases where that might be applied. And it's one of those technologies which could improve our lives, not just in terms of security, but in other areas touching on our convenience. But we won't have a bar of it. In other words, we will deny ourselves the advantages of the technology if we think that those who are seeking to deploy it cannot be trusted. Or worse still, if they do not have legitimacy in terms of the purposes for which they wish to make use of this. So I think the question you've posed really, although it starts off with being about technology and certainly a government's imprint, it ultimately becomes a question about the legitimacy of our governments and whether or not the kind of ethical infrastructure that one needs to build and sustain will be robust enough to sustain the technical infrastructure that could be of such benefit to society.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a brilliant answer, especially since that is essentially what I was getting at. Those governance structures almost always fail when that trust and that legitimacy isn't built and then accurately or well maintained moving forward. Mark, I'd love to hear your position on this, especially when thinking about leadership and that governance and policies surrounding either new policies or new technology implementation, and why they so often fail, and why people really, really distrust the purpose of the technology and that it'll be managed well.
Thanks, Sylvia. And I can only reinforce what Simon said. Just for your audience's understanding, I spent 35 years in crisis and emergency management and disasters and climate, and started on the end of the hose and ended up in the briefing the Prime Minister for a number of years. Trust is absolutely fundamental, and we have seen it erode over the last 10 to 15 years. I think what happened last summer, where ministers of governments chose to, it's controversial on one level, Sylvia, but it's actually a fact because it was, you know, it's there for the world to see, went on holidays rather than staying at their posts. And there were many people who did that, actually. There was a couple of quite prominent politicians, and there were some very senior officials who did the same thing. And it sends a pulse through a community that the politicians don't care. So it's not only are they breaching trust, but they don't care enough to suspend personal needs and place the needs of others above the needs of themselves. And it sort of leads to this notion of insensitivity, that if you're insensitive to the needs of another human being, you'll be naturally insufficient in your response to those needs. And we sort of see an insensitivity and insufficiency, a strict compliance with the regime of the rules, the regulations. There's not a lot of risk-taking or venturousness in relation to decision-making, and then a lot of defensiveness that turns up when things don't go well. So that does not augur well for reliance on technology. The irony is, and also to Simon's point, that so much could be improved with the use of technology in crisis management. I mean, we still have to put people in emergency services in harm's way to make sure people are out of harm's way, because we can't access mobile phone technology, for example, for location data because of the privacy concerns. So if we could take a pulse or poll where the mobile phones were in a flood affected area, we would know where to put emergency services to help evacuate people. But we can't do that at the moment because the trust levels aren't there. So we have to put people en masse into those spaces to find people to help to evacuate them. There's a lot of fraud that goes on with government payments, again, because the technology is not yet in place to secure the identity of a person before they make a claim in the context of, a loss and seeking some sort of recompense from the government. So Simon's spot on. This is an ethical question in every sense of the word, and until those things are cleaned up, and I think there are good examples in the leadership space of where we have secured the trust of community, and I think there's the doors then open up for great technological advances, but overall it's deteriorating. And I do wonder, after 35 years of advising on policy, and where is this going to go in terms of an increasing intensity and frequency of natural hazards, certainly an intensifying climate, let alone the world of cyber and the world of national security more broadly. And so that's going in one direction and trust is going in the other. So I think we have a problem. I think we have a big problem, and it's worthy of a comprehensive conversation in society about what it means to be trusted. What does it mean to care? And I think in public leadership, you have to care, and it has to be genuine. People will sense it if it's not. If the issue of integrity turns up there, of course. To what extent does the notion of caring for another person have integrity or not? And most people have a sixth sense about that. And if it lacks integrity, then people will sniff it out a mile. So I used to say, as Director General and Commissioner and Head of Task Force, that the greatest measure of success in crisis management was the upholding of public trust and confidence in the face of great adversity. And the greatest mission was the reduction of human suffering, that these things cause great suffering to people. And if those two ethics were lost, or we moved off them, or we lost our focus, we would get ourselves into trouble. That they had to be front and center all the time, and we should measure our decisions against them and measure our actions against them. And that would get us through, because in crisis, things often do not go well. They just don't go well. They don't go according to plan. And if you can maintain trust, maintain focus on the needs of others, then you probably get through. And that needs a whole lot of technological support to do that, of course. So.
Yeah. And on that note, Mike, what can private industry, since that's who we ultimately represent at the moment, and we're also members of the community, we all live across the country, we all see different issues play out in the public sphere, so they're very much still front of mind. But what can private industry do to earn more trust in this area? Do the values of the technology providers matter to government and more so to the public? Is there a role for us to take to really drive that interest in social issues as the technology provider, seeing as very often there is that vacuum, especially when a crisis does occur, and very often our leaders are missing in action?
Well, picking up on Simon and Mark's comments, so I fully agree that it is just as important for the private sector to hold and maintain trust as it is for government in the public sphere. as industries all over the world discover, when they lose trust and confidence, their business model falls apart. And I think one of the challenges as we're in the midst of this tremendous technological change, one of the great moments in human history where we're fundamentally changing technology, and just like most other times in human history where we've changed technology rapidly, we've often neglected the social and economic impacts that come with that. And industry, I think the lesson over the last 20 years of the digital revolution has been industry can't see itself simply as a technology sector, which is producing technology for what it considers the common good or for its profit motive. Industry has to recognise that it is part of a community. And picking up Mark and Simon's point, that's the first thing. Business and industry has to understand that it operates in a community. Its ability to operate and make profit as part of a community is really dependent on the community's acceptance and trust in that product. Because like most times, the regulatory structures lag behind the technology. And we've seen that last 20 years. Digital technology has gone down pathways and opened possibilities which no one could have imagined even a short number of years ago. But the regulatory structures haven't kept up. But the one thing you know, when technology loses the community's trust, regulators will start to catch up and put in place regulatory structures which may actually be adverse to the industry's growth. So industry has got to be aware of that the regulatory structures may actually be adverse to them and may actually reduce the benefits of the technology because the community has been so concerned about what the changes have brought. Coming back to your question though, what does industry need to think about? It's all of these things, that it needs to see trust, ethics and the way it behaves as core to its business. And I think that the real lesson for me as I've transitioned from the public to the private sector working with NEC has really opened my eyes to some amazing technology and some amazing engineering capacity. And the question in my mind is how well linked that is into the public policy questions we're discussing. And I think there are two key things which industry has to consciously be aware of. Firstly, are we developing the right technology for the right problem? What the digital age has shown us has been a lot of technological development in the last 20 years, but what problem has it sought to solve, or is it simply a profit revenue generating stream which has consequences, positive and negative? And so the first question to build trust in the community, can we actually demonstrate that we've actually got the technology which is addressing a real and the right problem? And if you look at something like facial recognition, which is a wonderful technology, as Simon says, there's enormous potential for good, but raised a whole range of issues in people's minds about who controls the data and what it's being used for, is really going to rise and fall as to whether we can convince the community that it is the right solution to a real problem that if we solve has benefit for them. And secondly, the other thing is we have to be very conscious of the fact that like any new technology, that we don't strive for efficiency and perfection in the technology at the expense of people's choice. Because once you remove people's choice, you actually enter a completely new world of responsibility to people. And I think often what we've seen in the digital age, we've said to people, here is some wonderful new efficient technology, but what we fail to do is to give them choice as to whether they use it or not. And this is really one of the issues when we come back to how government's going to roll out its next stages of technology like facial recognition or data matching or issues like service access. Are we giving people choices? Are we giving them enough understanding? And if we're removing choice, are we making a strong enough case to them that's to their benefit? And I think they're the sort of questions that we constantly need to be aware of. And coming to your second part of your question, do values matter? Does industry value matter to government? Yes, it does. Because if the values aren't underpinning the development of the technology, as I said, governments will regulate to get what they think is the right public policy outcome they're seeking. And that may actually be against the interests of the technology developers. And it's been interesting to see the way in which a lot of the social media companies are now reacting to, as regulators start to catch up to them, if I can put it that way. They're somewhat aghast that the government wants to play in their sphere. They don't see themselves operating in a public policy arena, but yet they do. And they influence the public policy arena so heavily. But they're actually surprised. And there's a terrific book that I read recently called Coders, developed by an American journalist who actually looked at the people who worked in the technology industry way back to the 1960s and talked about what a homogenous group they were of high achievers. But the one thing they all lacked as they developed wonderful technology, is they lacked any understanding of the social good or the public policy arena. And what's happening now is we're seeing the consequences of that. They built wonderful technology, but didn't explain it to the community and didn't think about the possibilities of the adverse impacts of that. So I think those sorts of things for any private company that wants to operate in a particular digital world, we have to be able to demonstrate values that align with the community and are able to take the community with us around key issues like choice, access, and fairness.
Hey, Sylvia, can I just highlight something that Mike was talking about then, which I think is really worth dwelling upon? There's 2 points. Firstly, a lot of technology companies and people who work within them think that their task is restricted to the technology itself. And they make the kind of mistake that a mining company might make in thinking that their boundaries end at the edge of their pit. In fact, a mining company's boundaries extend right throughout their supply chains and through communities and all the rest. And so technology companies, they have to think not just about what is the technology that they're building and what are the kind of ethical issues they design into it, which includes sometimes making sure that just because you can do something that you don't actually go on and do it. But it also is that part of what Mike was talking about, which is the perhaps even unintended consequences that flow from the technology. And I'm thinking here, for example, there are many forms of technology which are appearing now which have got the capacity to displace people from employment. Now, the people who make the technology would say, well, that's not our problem, is it? Surely we don't have to worry about that. We've just got to make sure that it fulfills its immediate function. Whereas I think they do have to worry about it, and that they've got to be just as concerned as, say, governments, that any transition that this would initiate is both just and orderly. It's not to say that they have to manage the whole process. They may actually put pressure on government to ensure that a just and orderly transition takes place and that they fulfil their function, but they cannot be indifferent to it. And I think this is the sort of thing that Mike's talking about, is a much richer notion of where the corporation lies in its relationship with society in general, but particularly if you're introducing radically transformative effects into that society.
I agree, and I think in many ways, Simon, my sense is that the technology industry has become so large and so dominant and driven by, as I say, if you look at some of the personality types that lead technology companies, particularly the social media and the like, they are almost where the car makers were in the 1970s, where they didn't see, and remember when in the US, when first consumer, Ralph Nader and others started to argue for consumer rights around motor vehicles for safety reasons, the motor industry said, well, what's it got to do with us? We produce a perfectly fine piece of technology. If it's belching smoke or kills someone at high speed, that's not our fault.
And if so it's legal, it's
what's
okay.
Happened to the automobile industry since then. Exactly. And look what's happened to that automobile industry. Those monoliths of the US auto industry had to change through a combination of regulatory but also market pressure, which they hadn't anticipated, and they could no longer see themselves as removed from the community, that their only drive was the profit dollar. They didn't have social responsibility, and I think we're at, with this technology change and what we're seeing with the economic shift that's taking place, we're already starting to see a revisiting of the Chicago School and the whole notion of corporate profit-driven responsibility, as opposed to all of the social consequences of someone else's problem, i.e. government. That if a large number of people become unemployed because of technology, that's not the technology maker's fault, that's for government to deal with. I don't think that's sustainable. And I don't think that, particularly in the democratic countries, that is going to be sustainable for those product manufacturers.
Yep, I totally agree, Mike. And just thinking kind of on everything that that all our panelists have mentioned, I sometimes wonder if a lot of our problems also stem from the fact that we kind of don't, or we are shielded by that corporation or technology bubble, that we don't interact with society on a number of different levels to actually see what's happening, how is technology actually being used, what challenges are people facing on a day-to-day basis, especially not talking about your own community, because we all live in our own private bubbles, but what's going on outside of the cities, since most of us are city dwellers. And going to you, Mark, I know a lot of your, especially your academic and theoretical work is very strongly for advocating for compassionate leadership. And I wonder if that's somewhere where private industry and technology producers have to go. I'm very lucky that NEC, after the last bushfire season, actually adopted a small rural town on the far south coast of New South Wales, Mogo. Because of COVID, it was only 2 weeks ago that I got to actually go down there, spent some time with the school, the preschool, community members, spoke to council. And it's only really, you know, despite speaking to a lot of people online and via email, it's only when you really push those boundaries and are able to come face to face with a community that, you know, day by day is struggling with certain challenges, that it really starts to sink in, and you can have that symbiotic relationship that isn't just surface level. So I wonder if, Mark, if that's somewhere where industry, private industry, should really be pushing to kind of get out of those, you know, HQ buildings, corporate buildings, out of the offices, and actually see what's happening.
Look, absolutely, Sylvia. I think in my 35 years, I've never, particularly after last season, but it's probably manifest when I was head of task force as well, but I'd never seen so much private sector interest in crisis management, for example, and it was a genuine interest. I think governments were slowly but progressively opening that policy door to the private sector, and it needs to, because governments can't contend with these issues on their own, and particularly the climate effects, and which are truly global, and the manifestation of the hazards that arise from them are becoming just too difficult for governments to deal with on their own. It is, and it's a leadership question in every sense of the word, Sylvia. It's a question of relatedness and it goes to I think in the private sector, to Mike's point also, that the private sector, business, governments hold immense equities of power, wealth, and resource in the context of their sector or the context of their elected position in society. And how are they utilising those in crisis, and what's driving that, and what informs it, and what values does it speak to? It is, I think, absolutely necessary to the extent at which we are able, as leaders, wherever we sit in the system, to relate to those who are going through something which is unpleasant. And I think that disasters are very overt about that. So there's just no ambiguity at all about people suffering in the middle of a bushfire, a flood, or a storm, or a cyclone, or an earthquake. I can promise you that. But those same sufferings are going on every day in a much more subtle way, and I think leadership often misses a lot of that and doesn't really understand that it's got the capacity to do a lot more about it than it gives itself credit for, or gives itself permission to do. And much of the leadership, I think, in the corporate world and in government is what I sort of call masterful or invulnerable, and it just refuses to look at, and to Simon and Mike's point, you know, the downstream effects of their decisions, just refuses to look at it because it's too painful, it's too difficult. It doesn't appear to be profitable, whatever. There's kind of like this willful ignorance that goes on in the decision-making process where the value proposition is too narrow. The thing about crisis is that it doesn't actually create any vulnerabilities at all. It just highlights them. It actually shows you where they are. It doesn't create any new vulnerability. It's those systemic vulnerabilities that people have to navigate are already in place, and because either technology's created them, or an absence of technology, or a poor policy decision of a government, or whatever. So those things sit in potentiality as a vulnerability, but they exist as potentialities. And then the disaster comes along, and lo and behold, we find a whole lot of vulnerable people. Well, we could have headed that off if we had thought more about it. So there is, and to your point about compassionate leadership, it's a big part of my life now, I think, and it's helping leaders to be much closer to those that they serve or lead or seek to inspire or seek to influence through notions of relatedness. it needs some skill, but it's kind of just about being human, essentially. I mean, whether you can scale it up, well, this can be difficult. How you scale up those more related aspects between people, but it can be done. And so, it's probably finish on the point and reinforce it, Sylvia, that the access to the equities of power, wealth, and resource, which are immense in society. I don't think half the leadership in institutions even understands what those things are and how they can be utilised for greater good. And to Simon's point and his report this week, and the benefits are just phenomenal by behaving that way and steering organisations in that direction. And the bottom line is, if you do it, you actually feel better. It's actually a happier space to be. I think it goes all the way back to Aristotle and the Buddha, for goodness sake. And, they were right then, and 2,500 years later, they're still right. So there's enough, evidence in human history to suggest that when we behave that way and we think that way and we come together on that basis, that just, disasters are very adverse and difficult experiences. The whole point of going through them, if you choose, or governments can't choose, of course, to ensure of last resort, but if you're a corporation and you choose to enter, then really you're choosing to enter to make someone's experience better, because it's pretty difficult already. So how do you give someone a better experience? That is an incentive or as a motivation for leadership, I think is what it's all about. So,
Sylvia, I think you and Mark separately have raised a really interesting structural question too. Now, I don't know if you recall when you were talking, you said, oh, well, you're in the bubble, but of course we're part of the community too. And then Mark's just introduced this notion of our common humanity. I think one of the big questions, this is for corporations in general actually, is just what is their relationship to the society in which they're based? And there's been an evolution. You've heard the language of corporate social responsibility, and then you had Michael Porter's notion of shared value. But those views, and social license to operate, I suppose, is another one. Those views all, in a sense, position business as if it is in a symbiotic but nonetheless somewhat parasitic relationship with society, where, in shared value that Porter advocates, you still pursue your self-interest, but you make sure the value is shared with others. What's really interesting, in the last 12 months, BHP has introduced a new concept which it's developed of social value. And rather than seeing itself as being something which is outside but in this symbiotic relationship with society, it's much closer to what Mark's talking about, where it says we are part of it in the same way that a heart is part of a body, and you need to have a healthy heart and a healthy body, and they both need to be healthy for the sake of the other. So it is a corporation is part of society. And I think one of the things we lost in the last couple of decades is this sense that business is part of civil society. We even talked about there being the market and civil society and government. Well, how do we ever let that division occur? So I thought it was really interesting when you said, well, I'm part of the community. I mean, that's true. And I think if we understand that, and Mark's point about our common humanity, maybe that will anchor these broader considerations about not just the role of the corporation, but particularly technology in terms of the human implications of what they do.
Yep, exactly. Mike, before we move on to the next question, did you want to add anything onto Simon's thoughts?
I fully agree. I think fully agree with Mark and Simon. I think Simon's point, I think the one thing that the digital age is bringing is a fundamental rethink of the role of the corporate sector, that it can't operate as a distinct body away from the community. And I think that's really what the pushback now is. And I think that will lead to a whole range of responses, and good companies will take the BHP approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, most definitely. So on to our next question, which isn't too far removed from the first, I hope. In November 2019, the New South Wales government released digital driver's licences. The uptake of these licences was phenomenal. 1.4 million of the state's motorists adopted the digital licence. For comparison, there is 1.6 million physical card holders. The New South Wales government is now advocating for the use of digital licences for more identity verification processes, including for check-ins at clubs, bars, and even poker machines, together with facial recognition to help identify problem gamblers. The New South Wales government wants to be the global leader in digital government services within the next 3 years. So in light of COVID and the need for accurate tracking of individuals entering certain venues, will the population of New South Wales in particular be ready for such a monumental digital change? And will we accept this as the new norm, especially as time moves on and the crisis hopefully starts to become contained? And fundamentally also, what does this mean for digital inclusion? Simon, can I start with your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm one of those people who has the digital license, so I've also got the hard copy. Look, I think firstly, we need to understand that I suspect a lot of the motivation for its uptake was pure convenience. I mean, these days, you're more likely to take your phone than your wallet. If you're going to forget anything, you'll forget your wallet because you've got a digital credit card or something like that, a digital license. And so it's just simply convenient to have it because you know wherever you go, you're unlikely to be caught out without it, whether it's the police asking to see a license or some proof of identity. But of course, this begs an interesting question, doesn't it, which you alluded to, which is I happen to be wealthy enough to have a smartphone with a digital license, and I can afford that. But I've just come back from travelling up in the Northern Territory for a funeral last week. And there are people in that community who don't have the same economic means which I enjoy, who in a sense are going to be disabled by a policy which presumes that everybody has that minimum degree of access to technology. So yes, I can see why it might be convenient for government, but if that's what it's about, it's not going to work any more than I think one of the great lessons in history was the mistakes that Monsanto made around biotech when they introduced a form of technology in gene editing which was convenient for farmers but which never brought consumers with them. Government will fall on the same perilous position unless they continue to do as they have, in this case, appealing to the convenience of the citizen, not the customer, I should stress, the citizen, because that's another important aspect in this. But what about everybody who is also a citizen? And remember, that is the most vital role you can play in a democracy because all authority comes from citizens, where you're not judged a citizen or not according to your wealth or your technology or other things. What happens if not every citizen can actually afford this in a way that's convenient for them? Does government say, well, we'll need to provide a minimum degree of access to this on basis of equity? Or does it drop its demand by trying to corral people into things that they simply cannot sustain? So I think there's some really profound questions about this whole venture. No matter how much I might find it convenient, I'd have to put myself into the shoes of all those who cannot, even if they wanted to, take up the opportunity.
Yep. Mike, any additional thoughts on top of Simon's?
No, I'd agree. I think it came back to my earlier comments that technology developers have to think about choice, particularly if they're taking choice away. And similarly with government, if the rollout of electronic license, digital license, or access to facilities through electronic facial recognition or databases, you've got to make sure that what's that do to choice? If people are getting a benefit for it, such as an entry to a club or a licensed premises or a restaurant, as we've seen through COVID, people are prepared to make those compromises if they know what it's been used for and they are comfortable that the benefit is there. And as Simon says also that it is equitable about how people are treated, that the technology doesn't discriminate, but also that it's fair in terms of providing access for all those who need to get access to it. People will happily go with the technology. But don't take choice away from people. And I think this is one of the dangers. And when I was in government, we often went for a very efficient solution, presuming that the efficiency of the system for government or for those users who we knew and worked with more closely, generally people who had choice, we often forgot, we just presumed everyone else would have to join in because then we'd left them no choice. That's the wrong approach. If you want to get people who then won't take up the technology and for whom the greatest benefit is, coming back to your example of a community like Mogo, Sylvia, it's extraordinary that it takes the bushfire for people to realise that Mogo School had no digital connectivity. A disadvantaged, predominantly Indigenous community that had no connectivity in 2020 until the bushfire came through. Now, that's unfair and reduces the opportunity given by digital technology. So I think that issue, as Simon says, you've got to make sure the systems are, you think about choice, equity, fairness, and at the same time that the value is there for people and it's actually solving the right problem. And I think all of those factors are really important if you're going to roll out systems which engage and bring the community with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I do wonder if that. I mean, they've put together a timeline whereby they'd like to achieve this this goal or this status of, you know, being the most digitally advanced government in the world, potentially moving forward within the next 3 years. But I wonder, Mark, is that almost in our current environment? And yes, I'm looking at New South Wales specifically here. But is that almost, you know, in light of everything that's going on with COVID and everything, is it doomed to fail, or are we in such a position at the moment where, because of the insecurities of the pandemic and other social and environmental issues that are going on, will the public almost be coerced in adopting this, you know, more so because they feel like their security perhaps is in question and that the government can do a good job in this area?
Look, I think so. But you know, again, Simon and Mike's points are really valid and on the money on this. I think well, COVID's it's a peril like you know, natural hazards and security threats and everything else, and governments are increasingly relying upon technology not only to, for example, issue warnings, but give it. And this will come out of the Royal Commission inquiry that's gone on into natural hazards. That citizens will become informants of intelligence for operations as well. So it won't just be the government's telling the citizen what to do or what's happening. It'll be the citizen telling the government what they're seeing, sensing and feeling, and that'll all be analysed through machine learning and artificial intelligence and turned into something, you know, more useful than we've ever seen in order to deal with the complexity of these hazards that we're now having to navigate. So, but to Simon's point, not everybody has access to that. And to Mike's point, if this is the new world, and it certainly is an enormous push to get this level of technology in place, and I'm sort of advising on that at the moment, but it's going to have to be a fundamental right, not a privilege, to have that level of access across the country if we're going to predicate public safety on a technology platform. As I said, I've been in the game 35 years, and when I first joined the fire service as a volunteer, we lost telecommunications in a bushfire. Well, 35 years later, we're still losing telecommunications in a bushfire. So, so I really worry that we're moving to a technological world for safety and for security, and the infrastructure and the backbone, the resilience, the adaptability, all of those words that we use in the space of critical infrastructure has not kept up with the hazard space. Yet we continue to march down the road of trying to make the world safer through technology. So I'm a great advocate for technology in this space, but there's got to be some good public policy that moves it from privilege to right. And to Mike's choice, Mike's comment, can you still give the citizen choice in this space? I'm not 100% sure, particularly with natural hazard perils, because the criticality of getting information out is such that, if a citizen chooses not to access information through a technology platform that may otherwise be affordable or available to them through some government program, it's going to be very difficult to guarantee their safety. And so I think that's the trajectory, but it's got to move. It's got to be supported by government policy that if they're going to predicate safety upon a technology platform, that it has to have the questions of equity and access become fundamental. And we don't have full coverage across the country on these platforms, and particularly in rural and remote rural and the Indigenous communities. And that's a big gap in my mind. But that's the trajectory. There's no turning back from that. And we saw inherent and significant delays in operational intelligence last summer from what the authorities knew and what was happening on the incident ground, because the single channel communications that go on between frontline firefighters or police or whatever in their operation centres just isn't fast enough and isn't comprehensive enough to deal with the complexity of what's unfolding. And people want more detailed information. They want to know. We say in our resilience policies and citizens should be situationally aware of what's going on around them. But here's the irony, that the agencies don't know what's going on around them because they can't pick it up quick enough. They can't sense it quick enough. So we're asking the citizen to be resilient and to be self-aware and aware of the hazard space, but the agencies aren't. So if we're going to continue down that trajectory of asking citizens to be more responsible, and I have quite some concern ethically about that, then we're going to have to get a lot smarter with this technology and make it a lot more accessible and a lot more accurate. There's some dangerous ground to be trod here, I think, before we get into clear space of understanding and effectiveness.
So if you knit all these comments together, I'm just wondering whether or not perhaps someone needs to say to the New South Wales government that they have perhaps the wrong objective. I mean, if it is, and I might be doing them an injustice by saying that what they want to do is to be the most digitally advanced government, that might be the wrong thing. Maybe what they should be bringing about are the most digitally enabled citizens.
Yeah.
Because if you did digitally enable citizens in one fell swoop, you then say, okay, well, I'm going to solve some of these problems of inequity. You then get that intelligence that Mark was talking about, because citizens are enabled to give more eyes on the ground, if you like, for the crisis agencies that have to manage things. And at the very least, the government might start thinking about itself as an enabler rather than as a director of these things. And that simple reframing could have very profound impact.
I agree. I think that's an excellent way to think about it, because as we're discovering, in Australia, as we've seen through COVID, we have a highly intelligent, educated, articulate community. Often in government, we forget that. And I certainly know in my experience rolling out programs when I was in government, we sometimes forget. We tend to focus on our own processes, not realising that just what the community holds. And there is still that, in many ways, an old style view that government is the source of wisdom and the provider. That's not the case, and the community doesn't work that way. I mean, COVID has been a fascinating demonstration of how sophisticated the Australian community and it actually is, and how well, and it is one of the reasons we have handled COVID in the way we have, is we have a highly educated, articulate community, and the word community matters to people. I agree with Simon. I hate to hear the word, when I was in government, I hate to hear the word customer or taxpayer. Community is what, because COVID shows Australians are looking for community.
Yep. I think if I can really lightly or broadly summarise, it shouldn't be about government goals, but about citizen goals, empowering people to live as well as they can within communities, if it can be worded in that kind of simplistic fashion. I think it would be good to now move on to some of our Q&A questions, since we are almost out of time, because I can see a couple of really good ones flowing in. Let's start with this one, perhaps. Dr. Longstaff, referring back to your quote from the Australian Financial Review, how exactly does ethics generate profit and revenue?
So the precise economic analysis is based on 75 data sets and 3 forms of economic analysis done by econometricians. But the basic thing is, if you've got a strong ethical foundation by which you declare quite publicly your purpose, your values and your principles, and then you act in accordance with that, so you act with integrity, then that builds trust. And the way that that generates greater economic returns is, firstly, it removes the deadweight costs that you would otherwise have to bear. So I'll give you a very simple example from our ordinary lives. If you trust someone, you'll shake hands with them or do the equivalent, and you'll make an agreement. If they break that trust, then you might still deal with it, but only with all of the deadweight costs that come with contracts, enforcement provisions and things like that. So you get greater efficiency and effectiveness inside businesses, and this has been known for some time, going all the way back to the book Built to Last by Collins and Porras, 2 Stanford academics that sought to explain the success of the most successful companies in the world. And what they found, it's not about relentless profit maximization or charismatic leaders, it's that consistent application of values and principles. You get the same benefits, though, in the economy, because the economy as a whole starts to be much more efficient and effective if that trust is maintained. The trouble is too often people look at trust as a thing in itself that sort of hangs in the air without realising that it's got to have those firm foundations on which it's built. And so what this work has done, it said, actually get the foundations right, those values and principles, get the ethics right. And you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be better. That's the incredible thing about it. And you will start to derive those benefits. And you will also avoid, of course, some of those losses which we've seen such public account for in terms of ethical failure. So that's how it works. It's not rocket science. It's immediately understandable. There's quite a bit of science around it, including around systems theory and the difference between using side constraints and internal ties and things like that. But I won't clog up the conversation with that at this point.
Yep, thank you. I think you answered that very concisely and very well. Just getting through some of the other questions. Lauren, just an FYI, my Q&A box has disappeared. But just having a look at the run sheet that we've got, there was really one excellent question posed by someone. And Mike and Mark, perhaps I'll direct this to you. How does private industry connect more with rural and incredibly vulnerable communities? Where do they start?
I'm happy to start, Mark, if that's right. I mean, I think firstly understanding that the market, and it's difficult because particularly for a lot of large corporates, they don't necessarily think the market is one that they'll go after. That naturally is a large market. But having said that, they need to think more broadly about that. As I said, that if you look at the technology sector, Australian regions are the most technologically advanced in the world. You get a better discussion about IT and technology in most country pubs in Australia than you will in any city and urban environment, because Australian farmers, Australian rural communities, they know more about coverage, they know more about how well a modem works or what the latest software package does, because it really is absolutely fundamental to how they operate as an economy, but as a community, much more so than in urban areas where people just presume that the mobile phone works or the app will come on. So understand that, what's driving it, understand the community, what makes up the community. As I said, it shouldn't take a natural disaster to bring some of the socio-economic disadvantage to the fore. Mark's point's right. Crises only really highlight cracks and failures. They don't create them. So understanding the vulnerabilities, understanding what the interests of those communities are, and what the real issues are for them and what their real problems are, I think is the important starting point for both public and private providers of services. Then you can start to see whether your product is actually meeting a real need and how best you tailor that to those communities.
Yeah, and I would just reinforce that, Sylvia. I think it is, again, it comes back to, a question of relatedness. And I know of private sector CEOs, one in particular, I won't sort of say who it is on this forum, but he went to the south coast of New South Wales and to immerse himself in what had happened, to really try and understand how his company and his business could help, because they were his customers. He understood the customer chain and where they lived, and so he actually went there and to understand. And in my own research, I saw when leaders did that, it makes a profound difference. It moves them as humans. It moves them to a direction which is really quite pleasing. But they can also symbolise what they see on behalf of a much broader group of people. So they have a personal human experience, a relatable or a related experience, and they can symbolise it to many others and do something about it. And so it's kind of like, I don't like the term the bubble, Canberra bubble or whatever. Canberra's a university town and it's a great place to think and do good public policy work, really. And I kind of reject the notion that public servants aren't in touch. I think they are, or many of them are, at least. But the notion of sort of getting out of the comfort zone and making an effort to go and, understand what people are going through, I think is really important. And I'm seeing business do that more and more. Minderoo Foundation is kind of doing that as well. It comes from the private sector. It's philanthropic. It sees itself as an accelerator and possibly even a disruptor. There's some complexity around that, which we don't have time to talk about today. But they've immersed themselves, and we ought not be afraid of that as leaders. We ought not be afraid of that. We should, develop the skills and the capacity, which is really just about being human, by the way. You don't need anything really special. Just off the soapbox or off the pedestal and, into the W's and C's with everybody else. It's kind of that simple. And then we do get to understand what people are going through, and we can make decisions which will help them and help the business as well, to Simon's point. There's nothing more inspiring than knowing you've helped somebody, that you've taken away, you've made their day better, or you've taken away some of their suffering, or you've related to what it is that they're going through. That ironically is a good day. My life was full of that. But the most disappointing days is when I didn't get a chance to do that, to be quite honest. It was, those experiences were fantastic. That's available to everyone. It's not just because I was in crisis. Anyone can go there.
Yep. I think that's probably the best final thought that we can end on. I think that summarizes what this whole panel discussion was about, to motivate us to listen, to learn, and to connect, and to show our humanity and to connect with others, and then use the technology to really solve the problems that the communities and individuals have, instead of creating them in our own minds and trying to think or try and guess what the problems might actually be, to actually go out there and connect with our communities on a much more meaningful and deep basis. So on that note, huge thank you to our panelists for your time. We were incredibly lucky to be able to spend this hour with you and to pick your brains on this topic. Thank you to all the attendees and all our viewers, and to anyone also tuning in after the event has taken place. Thank you again for your time. And we will be also reaching out to anyone who has signed up to this event to hopefully answer some more of your questions. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Thank you.